Hi, I'm Raj Nalari, manager in the World Bank Institute. Allow me to introduce my friend Jos Verbeek, who is manager in the Development Economics Prospects Group of the World Bank. He's also the team leader and author for this flagship report on rural-urban dynamics and the Millennium Development Goals. With that brief introduction, Jos, it's all yours.
Thank you, Raj, and thank you for this opportunity to present here, and thank you all for logging in and willing to spend your morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are, willing to listen to me. Now, I'm going to talk about a report that we do annually in the bank. It's a joint report with the IMF. It's called Global Monitoring Report, and the purpose of this report is that we report basically to our board, our governing body, and of course the development community at large on progress with respect to the Millennium Development Goals. But not so much really just the Millennium Goals itself, but we are supposed to look at policies that affect progress and the attainment of the Millennium Development Goals. So in the past we have looked at food prices and nutrition, we have looked at sustainable development issues. And this year we said, okay, we want to look at issues that are not just important for today, because we're very close to 2015 when the first set of Millennium Development Goals is supposed to expire, or we try, and new ones will hopefully come in place. So we wanted to look at an issue that carries over, that is important today, and has been very instrumental in making progress on the MDGs, but also will carry its weight in the next set of MDGs that's probably going to be set up between 2015 and 2030. So we wanted to look a little bit more carefully at these rural-urban differences and the rural-urban dynamics and see how urbanization can be a force for the good. Now, within the report, we basically have various areas that we look at. One is that we look at how is the global development, how the global development has, in a sense, impacted the progress to MDGs, like the global macroeconomic environment, the global trade environment, issues related to aid, has impacted progress towards the MDGs. And then we have a thematic focus. And as you are already understood, of course, that the thematic focus this time around was on rural-urban dynamics, with a particular focus on urbanization. So let me try to take you through the presentation. My outline is that I'm first going to say a little bit about the justification, very short, because I understand I'm not giving much more than 20 minutes, because we want to give the floor to you after the presentation to ask questions. I will say briefly something about these global development issues on the macro side, show you very quickly where we are on the MDGs and what are some of the remaining challenges, and then dive into issues of, what's the performance on the MDGs and other development indicators in a rural area versus urban areas, and what are some of the issues, the policy implications of all of this. Now, well, first I think we wrote the report in a manner, in such a way, much more from a positive perspective, meaning what are the practical implications of urbanization, then we really wrote it from a normative perspective, or a more dogmatic perspective, I sometimes like to say. Is over the next, between now and 2030, we are expecting that about 1.4 billion people will be added to the population in the developing world. And of these 1.4 billion people, 96% of them wants to live in urban areas. Yeah, these are projections done by the UN, and we, in a sense, take them as given. You might be here or there a bit off, but it's very clear that if only 4% wants to remain in rural areas of this increase in population, and 96% of this increase will happen in or around urban areas, we better get ready for it. So that was really the justification of this report. We said, look, if you just look at these trends between rural and urban population, it's very clear that people have a preference to living in urban areas, and we better get ready for that. Now, very quickly, something about the the issues of the macroeconomic environment and how conducive that is for making progress towards the MDGs. Because of course urbanization, as we know, doesn't take place, or rural-urban migration doesn't take place in a vacuum. It also takes place in an international environment. And the macroeconomic environment actually, globally, as we know, many of us, of course, has been quite challenging. But at the level of the developing countries, it actually has been quite good. In 2012 and 2013, basically growth in developing countries, in particular low-income countries, was 5 times the level of growth in high-income countries. It was close to 6%, while in high-income countries it was only like 1.2%. So the growth environment for developing countries to make progress on the MDGs has been quite good. However, there are always howevers in these type of cases. There are 2 things that we need to keep in mind. One is that the developing world, when the global crisis emerged in 2008, 2009, or was playing out in 2008, 2009, they very much used up their buffers on the fiscal side and foreign reserves and on the monetary side. And these buffers, as we like to call them, meaning you have some room to maneuver if another crisis hits, have not really been rebuilt. So that's going to be a challenge for still many developing countries. They use their fiscal space to increase expenditures and manage the lower revenues, but they haven't really, in the current environment, they haven't really reduced expenditures, or they haven't rebuilt their reserves that they used during the initial crisis. So that's something one has to pay attention to, because if another crisis hits, they have much less room to maneuver and to do good macroeconomic policies as they were able to do in 2007 and 2008. Another issue, of course, is that in the past, we saw many times that if one came out of a crisis or things like that, that the economies were really helped or pushed or pulled, you can say, by the developed world. And of course, at the moment, that's not the case. And for many, maybe quite a few years more, that will not be the case. So developing countries are really on their own to increase their own productivity to be able to maintain these high growth levels that they currently are experiencing. Yeah. On the other issues that we often look at in this report on related to trade, many of us know that the Doha Round, which is a big international gathering, or was an international gathering in Doha many years ago, to try to achieve improvements in the global trade regime, has not really brought the goodies that it was supposed to bring, and is not anticipated to bring any goodies in the near term. So the trade environment hasn't really improved much for developing countries. The same is related to aid. Aid, actually, what we call official development aid, mostly from OECD countries towards the developing world, also in 2013 was not at the level that many had expected or many had promised. And that's, of course, for a large extent due because of the fiscal situations that many OECD countries find themselves in. Let's move quickly to what I would like to call the report card. You should know that basically these MDGs, there are 8 groupings of MDGs, of which 7 are really focused on the human development agenda of people, and 1 is really about the global partnership agenda. Now, out of these 7 or 8 MDGs, we have 21 targets. And we monitor these 21 targets by 60 indicators. This all gets maybe a bit confusing, but you must see that we have Millennium Development Goals. Like I said, we have 8 of them. 7 are really looking at the people's agenda, the human development agenda. 1 is on global partnerships. We monitor these 8 MDGs through 21 targets, for which we again have 60 indicators to see if we are getting there. Now, 4 out of these 21 targets have been met, basically by 2010. I will show you in a minute which one. But if we're looking, and we will do a little bit of that because I won't stay there too long, because I want to move on much more to the policy agenda soon, and certainly given the limited of time that we have. We will see that we basically, even if there are MDGs that are being met, like for example the one that we anticipate to be met by 2015 on gender equality, if we look at globally it's met, but if we start looking at it at the country level, then we see that only maybe 72 out of the 104 countries that we are monitoring under the MDGs are actually meeting this MDG. Now, at the same time, it's not all bad what's going on. We also see that like for example on MDG, which is on child mortality, that 18 countries are on track to meet that MDG, only 18 out of 144, but we also know that 20 are very close to meeting it. So they have also quite a lot of candidates that we try to discuss with countries, that they are very close to meeting it. So they make a little bit of extra effort, or we accelerate, or we put more resources there, or we put improved policies, then maybe these countries could get and meet the MDG still by 2015. Sorry. globally, we have two uh, uh, big graphs that I want to quickly take you through. And we have one where we look at the main MDGs that we monitor. That is the MDG on extreme poverty, primary completion rate. Well, you guys can all read. I was once in a seminar with Mr. Arrow, and he was also having things on his Kenneth Arrow, one of the Nobel Prize winners, and he said, "Oh, I'm here at the World Bank presenting. I should assume that everybody can read what's on the slide." So I'm not going to say too much what's on the slide here, but you can see that basically 4 MDGs have already been met. That's the one on extreme poverty reduction. We have met that one in 2010. The same is the ratio of girls to boys in primary education, but we haven't done it yet in this the primary and secondary education. And we have been able to meet the MDG on access to safe drinking water. And to some extent, surprisingly, we have also improved met the MDGs on the slum dwellers. Now, the slum dwellers is a bit of a funny one in a sense, because at the outset of the when the MDGs were designed or agreed upon, they thought that the total amount of people living in slums was about 160 million. Yeah? So then improving the lives of at least 100 million seemed very ambitious. But of course, very quickly later on, one actually found out that close to 1 billion people were living in slums. And then, of course, if you improve the lives of 100 million, it's not necessarily very ambitious. So, but one didn't want to go back and change that MDG. So this is an MDG that actually has been met already in 2012, while in a sense the target was for 2020. And if you look at the other MDGs, the way you interpret this graph is that the light brown one is where we should be, and the dark brown one is where we already are, because it's trying to calculate the distance that we have already achieved versus the distance that we should have achieved. And you see that many of the other ones, it's going to be very tough to meet them globally. For example, primary completion rate, we know now already that globally is not going to be met. Why? Because for kids to complete primary school, there needs to be also a 100% enrollment rate, and we haven't achieved enrollment rates today. So we know for sure that unfortunately that MDG cannot be met by 2015. Now, like I said briefly at the earlier slide, we can also look at this not globally, but we can look at the country level, and then of course the picture, because we have to be a bit more humble, because here we see that on many of the MDGs we have a good number of countries meeting them already, but quite a large number of countries which are not going to make it. Here we have made 4 or actually 5 categories. One category is that countries have met the MDG, that's the green one. Then we have a sort of a yellow one, which shows that countries are making sufficient progress to meet the MDG by 2015, but haven't met it yet. And then we have 3-4 categories, which basically indicate that you might be very close if you make a little bit of effort, meaning you are expected to meet the MDG between 2015 and 2020. If you make a serious effort, you could maybe still make it. Then we have countries that are moderately off target, expected to meet it with 2020, 2030. They're making progress, but certainly not fast enough. And then we have ones which are seriously off target, meaning really the countries are stagnating on progress. There clearly is not just a resource issue, but there's a clear cut also a policy issue probably that needs to be addressed. And then we have a bunch of countries that we have insufficient data. And I think always like to point out the one which is really, for us at the World Bank, very troubling is that we have, for 31 countries, we still don't have proper household budget surveys to measure if we are making progress on poverty and many of the other MDGs. Let's move on to look at some of the issues between rural and urban. Like I said, that why does urbanization matter? Well, more than half of the world's population lives in urban areas. And like I said at the outset, 96% of the additional 1.4 billion people which will be added to the population in the developing countries between now and 2030 will live in urban areas. Now, some of that is, of course, growth of population in urban areas itself. Other parts will be migration, but it's very clear that people have a clear preference to living in urban areas. And like I said at the outset, we need to prepare for that. We need to be ready. Now, also what we see is that actually the prevalence of poverty and also of other MDGs is much better in urban areas than in the performance is much better in urban areas than in rural areas. Globally, in 2008, we calculated that 22.7% of the developing world was poor, And if we look at that same, we divide it up between rural and urban areas, we see that the urban population only 11.6% is poor, while the rural population 29.4% is actually poor. So now you might say, so actually poverty is still a rural phenomenon. That's true. But if we are starting to look what's happening on the dynamic side, we see actually that rural population, the poor, declined by about 500 million people, while the urban population, the poor, only declined by 15 million people between 1990 and 2008. So the world is, I don't want to say that we can already argue that most of the poor are living in the urban area. That's not the case, because still 76% of them lives in the rural area. But certainly the decline in the rural area is much faster than in the urban area. And part of that, of course, is due to migration. But at the same time, of course, we see that urban areas are much better in dealing with poverty than the rural areas. So we need to acknowledge that. Now, similar is very much true on, we start looking at some of these service delivery indicators. Like, for example, here we know for sanitation that 80% of the urban residents versus 50% of the rural residents have access to a toilet. So again, urban areas do in water and sanitation much better than their rural brethren. And if there actually is, to some extent, equality in access to services, like we're showing here on the graph on education, and you will see basically that the blue colored is the urban access or gross primary enrollment rates, and the yellow spots are the rural ones. You see that there's some type of equality there. But then actually, if we are looking at the quality of education, and that's the graph on the right side, and of course, I must admit, we don't have the quality indicators for all the countries that we would like. But it's very clear that when we look at the quality of education, that it's in urban areas, it's much better than in rural areas. Now, some of the causes are that the teacher absenteeism, also the teachers not necessarily want to be in the rural areas. It's the same with health. We see the same results. If there is some type of, on the quantity side, there's some equality, then on the quality side, there's a lot of inequality, because again, nurses and doctors are not necessarily interested in living in the rural areas, but prefer really to live in urban areas, as many of the other people do. So here also, we have to design policies to think about how can we entice teachers to live and teach in the rural areas, and the same with doctors and nurses. Another interesting thing I like to mention is that when we started looking in the report on where actually the poor are, and what do we know a little bit about their location, that many times we think that the world is bipolar. No? Many of us think it's a bit of a, well, many of us might not. I hope many people who are on our webinar today are not thinking this anymore. But many people, when you talk to people in the street or relative average person, they think that very much that the world is sort of bipolar, meaning you live in an urban area or you live in a rural area. And actually what we find, of course, is that people live across a whole continuum. People live in rural areas, they live in small villages, they live in secondary cities, they live in towns, they live in large cities. And it's really a continuum over time, over the geography, over the place. But not necessarily this is the case for poverty. Poverty is still very much a rural phenomenon, and it's also actually very much still a small town phenomenon. Now, I have here two graphs on the screen. One is for India, and here you see poverty over time for rural areas, urban areas, small towns, medium towns, and large towns. And it's very clear that if you look at the graph, that in India the poverty is not necessarily a large town phenomenon. So even while we are thinking, okay, we have poverty in the rural areas, that's where most of the poor are, then we have a smaller contingency of poor people in the urban areas. Very often what we have seen in the past, that then there is some type of megacity bias. One really wants to deal with the large cities. But that's not necessarily where the poor are coming together, or where the poor are agglomerating. And the same is the case, is evidence we show here for Vietnam. Again, we have a slightly different way of presenting it here. It's a share of urban population that is poor versus the share of the total urban population. And again, we see that actually the largest share is agglomerating in Vietnam, again, very much in small towns. Now, these are these emerging new towns that are coming up when people are migrating. Apparently, rural people first like to migrate to smaller towns and not necessarily right away to the big towns. So hence, poorer people agglomerate in small towns, and that also means that for policy design, we need to keep that in mind. We are very often, when we think about, we need to better plan, better organize cities, we very much have a focus towards the larger cities. And we need to recognize that if we want to deal with poverty and we want to do with better service delivery, that actually we really need to focus also on the smaller towns. Now, what are the advantages of urbanization? Basically, I think there are two channels through which urbanization really helps. First, urban agglomeration helps for better paying jobs and also in service delivery, like I hope I've shown. And then in a sense, it helps to reduce poverty. But that's of course is very much related to the way that we currently like to produce manufacturing goods and the way we like to produce services. And there seems to be in the world that people who are in manufacturing and people who are in services production, they like densities. They like to be in urban areas and they like to produce in or around urban areas. So as long as we don't change that, as long as we're not able to change that, we must anticipate that people will come to urban areas for a seek of better jobs and better paying jobs. Now, at the same time, because of this population density, of course, we have scale economies. Yeah, we have lower fixed cost of network services, particularly water and sanitation. In the report, we are showing that, for example, in Niger, the cost of 1 gallon of water in the rural areas is 5 times the cost of getting water out of the pipe system within the city in Niger. So again, poorer people have better and often cheaper access to services. And so that are the two main channels. One is a channel by which we have that the urban agglomeration provides for more jobs, because that's where the manufacturing jobs are, that's where the service jobs are, and they are just also paying better than agricultural jobs, unfortunately, or fortunately, depends on which position you take. But in a sense, this is currently how it is. And then, hence, urban areas are better in poverty reduction. At the same time, the population density allows for particularly these type of where we have large fixed cost or sunk cost, like we like to call it, for network provision of services. They provide for scale economies, and through that reason, again, we have better service outcomes in urban areas. But we cannot just assume that urbanization or unfettered urbanization will just bring the goodies. Unfortunately, that is not the case. We need to manage urbanization, and that's also one of the main messages we try to bring out in the report. Yeah, because if we do not manage it properly, we will see that people end up in slums, or that we get such type of densities that that pollution gets so high that health issues become a major concern. And I think with a health major, we often think about cities in China, but it's the same of cities across basically East Asia. It's also in Bangladesh. It's also issues in India. Now, here, of course, this is the population living in slums. I should explain to you the acronyms, I guess, at the bottom, because these are typical World Bank acronyms. The one on the left are still the largest numbers of slum dwellers are. It's East Asia Pacific. Small numbers we see in ECA stands for Europe and Central Asia. The medium numbers are in Latin America and the Caribbean. M&A stands for Middle East and North Africa. SAS, there are still large numbers, but also large improvements have been made. Is South Asia. And SSA stands for Sub-Saharan Africa. So we see that we still have a big problem with slums, and that we haven't really been very successful in diminishing them over the years. Now, let's go into, for the remaining 10 minutes, I guess, that I have been given, let's talk a little bit about some of the policy areas that we are advocating within the report that people and policymakers should be paying attention to. First, I want to say, of course, that these type of policies that we are putting forward here, particularly on rural development, rural urban mobility, slums, and urbanization, do not happen in a vacuum. They happen within an overall policy environment. In particular, I think we need to realize that if you want urbanization to be successful and to be able to provide you with the jobs that it can bring, then of course you need to have a good business environment and a good investment climate. At the same time, of course, we need to also realize that decisions get made at the local level, and the way that institutional arrangements have been set up is also very important. Let me give you one example. If we think about during the dissemination event that we did for this report, we also visited, I visited Manila, and I visited Beijing, and I visited, I want to say Constantinople, but it's Singapore. And Singapore, we know, of course, is 100% urbanized, no? But it also has one authority who deals with all the decision making. While in Manila, basically the metropolitan area has 6, 7 elected mayors, and they have to come together and make decisions to make sure that Manila remains a livable city. You can immediately see that that not necessarily is very efficient. No? I'm not saying that we should have a system by which you have one authority, but one needs to realize that one goes into these type of discussions on making a certain area function better as a metropole or as an urban area, that these type of administrative organizations will play a role. Yeah? Because even in Beijing, we heard that where you also have multiple municipalities as part of the overall metropolitan area of Beijing, that the underlying coordination between the various municipalities is not always very perfect. For example, I was given an example that we have a metro stop which is like more than a mile away from the bus stop. In a sense, if you want to deal with proper coordination, you want the bus stop to be very close to the metro stop so that people, when they come out of the subway, can go straight into the bus and don't have to walk a mile because the bus station is in a different municipality. So these are things that we should keep into our mind and recognize upfront. Let me take you through a few of the things, of the policy areas that I'd like to highlight. One, we should not forget about rural development. And very often what we see is that people see rural development versus urban development. It's not a soccer game. It's not rural team against the urban team. We need to understand that rural and urban development are very much interrelated with one another. Because people in the rural areas want access to markets. And where are these markets? These markets are often for them in urban areas. At the same time, and this might be very much agriculture. Of course, I'm bringing it a little bit simplistically, but I think you get the point. Rural producers, mostly agriculture, want to sell their produce in urban areas, while the urban producers of services and manufacturing goods wants to export and sell their produce to rural citizens. So hence it's very important to connect the markets. But also, what's still also very important is that you need to address productivity gaps. Let me give you one example of this. FAO did a report in 2011, and they looked at what the maize production in sub-Saharan Africa could be given local conditions. It's not asking to be at the production frontier like maybe the US is, or where Brazil is, or where the Ukraine or Russia are. No, just local conditions. And they estimated that the productivity gap was 75%. So there's still a lot of improvements can be made in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, in agriculture. This was maize production, to be able to just take advantage of the local conditions and get production up. And that will really help, of course, improve living conditions in the rural areas. Then another issue is, how do we deal with rural-urban mobility? Now, in various regions, we'll see that urbanization has not really taken off yet. I think MENA is still relatively low urbanization. Sub-Saharan Africa is very low on urbanization. Maybe you will be a bit surprised, but even India is relatively low on urbanization compared to some of the other countries. So with these countries, we can still expect a lot of urbanization to take place. Now, some of it takes place through growth from population, and other takes place because people are migrating. And about average, it's calculated around 40% of urban population growth becomes through migration. Now, if you look at the MDGs, you have certain MDGs that can be produced and provide services to people or improve human capital, like health and education, which we like to say these are mobile. People can take it with them. So we are trying to say in the report, okay, if you're fiscally constrained and you still expect high migration, focus on human capital related MDGs. Get people healthy, get people educated so that when they come to the cities and actually they're looking for a job, which probably requires different skills, they much easier adapt into the job market there than if they would come without much education and not necessarily as a healthy person. However, of course, if there is low migration, like many people, for example, in Latin America, we do not anticipate a lot of migration to happen anymore, and there's maybe less of a resource constraint because these countries are a little bit richer than, say, the countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Then we say focus on all MDGs, deliver on all of them. Many people sometimes say, oh, we need to be worried about all this migration, but we should also realize people do not move all at the same time. Then the issues related with slums, and I'm being told to hurry up, and actually the most interesting part is still coming. But we need to deal with the legacy of slums now. It's a disgrace. I mean, people who live in slums often don't have residency, and because of that don't have access to health and education. Often they don't have tenancy, so then also the utilities don't want to come in and provide piped water or put in sanitation systems or even provide electricity. So we need to deal with these issues. You need to provide them residency, as we're saying in the report, and you provide them tenancy so that there are no discriminatory pieces in place, and there is no reason for a utility not to come there and expect that this house that's now there is 6 months from now not there anymore. Then we provide in the book a framework for urbanization so that we can actually really manage urbanization well. And what we see often is that people start with looking for financing. And actually in the book we make a very strong pledge or a very strong argument that you shouldn't start with financing, but you should really start with planning. And we need, the way that we try to write this up in the report is that how are we going to make actually urbanization a force for the good? Okay. So we need to start with planning. We need to plan for all these people to arrive in cities. We have about 96% of 1.4 billion people coming to developing countries, cities, and urban areas. So a few things that we're saying in the book. Okay. Make sure that you value your land appropriately, because that's one of the biggest assets actually a city has, or an emerging city has. But at the same time, you need to plan. You need to be not an ostrich. You need to plan for these people to come. Don't stick your head in the sand, but really think about what type of investments are necessary to make the city work, and also for the city to maintain, in a sense, its comparative advantage in job creation and its comparative advantage in service delivery. Yeah. Another important thing is to think about what we call connecting, but it is really about dealing with the congestion, and dealing also, in a sense, with some of the other negative externalities that are there, like pollution. But you really need to make sure that you connect the city not only to internally, so that people through public transport, for example, can go from work to home, but also that you properly connect the city to the hinterland, which are the rural areas, and also connect it to its external markets. And then you start thinking about the financing of all of this, because you want to be in the driver's seat. If you want to be in the driver's seat, you first plan, and then so that you have your plans, and then when financiers come, because often in developing countries we see that donors or other private partners have their own plans, and they come to a government, and then the government has basically no plans, or only plans to a certain extent developed, and then they go with the financing that this donor offers, but this donor has then a particular preference for a particular investment, which is not necessarily the one that the government had in mind. So you need to plan in advance to make sure that you can rank your investment project, and then when a donor comes with money and has a certain idea, you can say, well, sorry, your idea is very interesting, but it's ranked number 10, and we have another 2 or 3 much more important ones where we would really like to use your money for. Okay, let me quickly summarize. On the macro issues, I mentioned that enhance domestic growth opportunities and rebuild buffers. The report card we want to emphasize that we should focus on all those MDGs that with an acceleration can make it by 2015. Rural-urban disparities, it's very clear the urban population is better off regarding MDG achievements than their rural brethren. It's important to realize that poverty is accumulating much more in smaller towns than in the larger towns, and that rural and urban development are interrelated. It's not a soccer game. We are in this together, the rural and urban peoples. Urbanization matters. It can be a force for the good. Don't hinder it, but prepare for it. Do the planning. Think about the connecting to make sure that you deal with the densities, and then think about the financing. On migration, we say facilitate mobility. Again, don't hinder it. If resources are limited within a country, which often is the case, then focus on human capital related MDGs so that people are ready when they enter an urban market or job market or start living in urban areas. And then address the legacy of slums to eradicate urban poverty to the maximum extent. And continue to focus on rural development because that's where still 76% of the poor people live. Thank you very much. I was to tell you one more thing. I prepared some hopefully interesting questions. We're going to do one. I had prepared 3, but we will do one of them. And the question, actually, I like the other question better. Can we do the second? Oh, people immediately. I actually want you to not answer this question, but I would like you to answer the second one. You know, what are your opinion, the main negative externalities of urbanization? Is it pollution? Is it crime? Is it slums? Exposure to natural disasters? This is like a bit of a poll for me because I would like to see what you think are the main issues that are important to think through when you are planning for urbanization in cities. On the negative side, no? On the positive side, we have different things. So thank you very much. Well, it looks very interesting. Many people are worried about pollution. So far, from the people who have voted, we have 100% of the vote. If that's up to 100%, we have 46% voting for that pollution is the #1 problem. And very close second at the moment is the issue of slums. And then at the bottom is exposure to natural disasters and crime. Very interesting. Thank you. I see a few questions. Quite a lot of questions. Can we enlarge some because I can't read the whole text? Sorry. Oh, sorry. I was supposed to do something. Sorry, it's my first webinar, so forgive me a little bit. Okay, Cecilia is asking about, let's see, it's interesting in understanding the synergies that can be strengthened between urban and rural. How to create complementary and win-win actions. I would love also, okay, some practical examples. I'm not a very practical person. At least that's what my wife tells me. Okay, what are some of these things that we can strengthen between urban and rural? I think one of the things, like we said, is in a sense, you want to strengthen connectivity between rural and urban areas, particularly if we think more about the more traditional developing economy where the rural population still heavily is engaged in agriculture and the urban areas are maybe underdeveloped and the densities are not really there yet to really have manufacturing and services take off. Then it's really important to make sure that the farmers can get their stuff to the markets. That's #1. And if that's happening, then of course, and if we deal with these productivity gaps, because even all these things are really interrelated. I mean, if you get improved productivity, then in a sense you can, on the one hand, people then say, yeah, but then people get unemployed. No, not necessarily, because if you become more productive in producing agriculture produce, somebody needs to can these things. No? Then agro-processing will, at some point in time, start taking off. Yeah, and this agro-processing, again, will be probably taking place more in the urban areas. But to get the produce there, to get it into agro-processing, you need roads. So there is really some of the synergies, I think. And then again, the other synergy, if you see the excess labor emerging, then of course you want also this job creation through this agro-processing, and maybe again, then agro-processing is taking place, it might go for export markets. Then again, you will have to have the services to be able to trade these products abroad. So it's like, it's first looking for something that really can start things going, and then the synergies in a sense will come together. No, it's a sequencing of how these things work together to be able to get the improvements in the livelihoods of the rural people, and also in a sense of the people who find then their livelihoods more and more in the urban areas. Yeah. I hope that answered that one. Let's try another one. Chiyung Wang. Elaborate on the division in small towns in India. Yeah, actually we have this. I would have to look it up. It's repeat the question. Repeat the question. Okay. Chiyung, your question is if I could elaborate on the definition of small towns in India, where you mentioned urban poverty is getting concentrated. Um, I can look. It's in the book. If I may make a little advertisement, you don't have to buy it, although I don't mind. But you can find it actually online. The book. It's at World Bank www.worldbank.org/GMR 2013, and all the chapters are there for you to download. And this particular definition is in chapter 2, and it should be on page. I'm trying to figure it out very quickly for you. It should be on page. So if you download it and you find it, it should be on. My goodness.
It's more than 100,000 people.
Well,
Village is 100,000.
there are quite a few different definitions because we have like 4 or 5 of these groupings that we have done, and I'm trying to see it here. I think the small towns are somewhere between less than 50,000, and the medium towns are more like between 50 and a million, and the large towns is everything over a million, if I'm not mistaken. But anything you do, the way you look at this is actually, you should really look at it at the country level. I think we try not to do these global definitions in this case, because it's really what's relevant for a country in this case. Okay. Thank you. We're trying another one from Eileen Sullivan. How do you define migration to urban areas, particularly where in certain areas it is seasonal migration? Yeah, we define migration as you have both types of migration. No, we have you call it seasonal. Some places I used to live in Poland for 3 years for the World Bank, and there you had even migration every weekend, and every weekend you had all the people leaving Warsaw going back to the rural areas. The way we define here in the book, migration is really is more permanent migration. So we are defining it, but of course we are cognizant that these other types of migration are also there. And why does this other type of migration happen? If people seasonal, or if people are going only for the weekdays to the city to work and then in the weekends move back, can of course have to do with that they don't get necessarily residency. No, I mean China had a program, and still to some extent has a program in place by which it not automatically provide residency for people who are migrating from the rural areas to the urban areas, although it's revising these type of policies as we speak, ongoing. Yeah, we have another question here from Mr. Sonny Park. Oh. He's asking, would it be better to think of policies to move the development out of the urban to rural? Now that's an interesting question, and many people say, yeah, but why don't we try to get these manufacturing and services job in the rural area? No? And I think the problem is that it has been tried in the past, and it has actually failed in many places. No? If you get in the rural area a big enough agglomeration to happen, so that you get these new cities emerging, yeah, like all around the world in a sense, new cities are emerging. If you can get that to happen closer to the rural areas, then of course yes, then these jobs and the better service delivery can happen there. But otherwise, we just have to see. We have all these planned cities, and actually we discussed some of these planned cities in the report, particularly in for example the experience in Russia, which was of course during the Central Plan time or its communist time was much more orchestrated than anywhere else in the world. And many of these cities are dead now because they were put in places where people didn't want to live and where it economically didn't make sense. Yeah, we know that also if you look at many of the big cities, they are often close to a waterway or at a coastal area. Or where they have good access to roads or good access to the hinterland, for example, if they want to deal with agriculture production. So yes, you can try, but you have to be very cognizant to the fact that these cities will not necessarily stay alive very long if they get artificially put in a place where actually the business people don't want to set up their businesses. Okay, let's take another question. I see here one from Thomas Dunmore. He's asking, he's thanking me for the presentation. Thank you very much. You're welcome. Do you have a sense of where economic inequality is experienced more severely, in rural or urban areas? My sense is that people moving to cities, living in slums for instance, experience inequality more severely than in their home region. And this must have implications, for example, on social unrest, crime, etc. I think, Thomas, you're absolutely right. I think this is a very good point. The issue is that I wouldn't. It depends a bit on what you, of course, define with inequality. But the point is that if you get people to move from a rural area where they are poor, and they move to an urban area, and they are coming there actually because what we sometimes like to call they're being pushed to the urban area because there's such a devastating situation in the rural areas, then these people not necessarily find a better livelihood in the urban areas. And there, of course, in the urban areas where the manufacturing and services jobs are, which are of better income generating than the agricultural related jobs, inequality automatically will be higher. No, we need to anticipate, we need to acknowledge that. And of course, if we then we are not planning for the arrival of these people, then of course these people, as you point out, will be ending up in slums. And we know that from many data that we have seen around service delivery in slums, and Nairobi is a clear-cut example, is that the slums have as worse service delivery indicators as the rural areas. So many people, if they move and get into slums, they're not necessarily getting all these wonderful improvements that I showed during my presentation. No? So we need to. That's why we're also making this big point that we do need to deal with the legacy of slums. We need to make sure that these people get the same type of service delivery as the people who are already living in the urban areas, or in what people would like to call maybe proper urban areas, or urban proper. Okay, let me take another one. I see here Toyoka Kodama. He has a long question. Okay. Oh, sorry, what did I do? Okay, again, he's thanking me for the presentation. You make my day. I would like to dig deeper on management of urbanization. If you look at urbanization and poverty reduction in the past decade, China has contributed a lot, correct? Absolutely. And we could safely say that China is managing urbanization relatively better than its peers, okay? Concerning that urbanization will happen more in Africa and India, where it's not easy to see the same commitment and/or efficiency from the local government, what kind of lessons do these countries learn from the China example? I think I think there's probably a lot to learn from China. When actually a week ago I was on the Chinese radio and they asked me, what can China learn from the other countries? And I said, well, actually a lot of the other countries can actually learn a lot from China. Because, what did China do? I think China invested heavily in infrastructure in and around cities. It focused on cities that initially it really thought had potential to grow from a business perspective on the manufacturing and services. That's why you see the initial mega cities in China emerging at the coastal areas like Shanghai and some of those cities. And yes, I think the way that China also managed or tried to manage the migration, that people didn't come all too fast into the cities because they weren't ready from a housing perspective and things like that. Now, on the one hand, it's a tough issue to deal with because you're making it very tough for the people who are migrating back and forth. But at the same time, it seems to have worked. So there are lessons to be learned from this managed migration and the planning of cities. And yes, I mean it will be more tougher in sub-Saharan Africa or in India. But at the same time, we see, of course, in the last 5 or 10 years, I think there's much more willingness to do South-South learning than really to learn from the Old West, if I may say so. So I think there is a willingness to listen really to what China has done on the urbanization side and how it has managed that over the years. Okay, let me take another question. Miyazaki. She asked, how can we minimize the development of informal settlement slums in the outskirts of cities? Yeah, that's planning. That's I know it's a relatively maybe simplistic way of answering it, but planning is a big thing here. I mean, if you know that people are coming to your cities, you need to prepare for it. And planning housing and planning developments is very important for that. You don't want people to just come and then settle in. And what often, of course, also happens, and we see that in a lot of the Latin American countries, was the case that many of these slums are settling in very hazardous conditions. It's not necessarily the best way of building a house if they are left to themselves. So also planning to make sure that these type of slums are not being set up, because slums often become permanent residents at some point in time in hazardous positions around the city because they go up on very steep hills, or they are at an area where the river might overflow a lot because that in the past nobody cared living there. So poor people often are find ways to live there. So again, planning is a very important, and recognizing that we can expect people to come. I see. Yeah, I will take here. I can take one more question. I will take one from Sumbaya Mutambala. The issue of productivity gaps and market connectivity. What are the roots and causes of these gaps? I think there is way to emphasize on technology upgrading for rural areas to be competitive. Currently they produce, but not enough, and no value addition that can be made them competitive in the local, national, and global market. Yes, I think to improve productivity in the rural areas in sub-Saharan Africa, I think that's what you are referring to, is really a very traditional agricultural agenda. We need to get extension services out there so that people know when to put the seeds in, when to use the fertilizer. We need to make sure that we work on the connectivity so that when they are getting the produce ready, that they can actually sell it, and that it's not sitting on the farm and rotting away because they have bad connectivity to markets. So I think it's still a very traditional agenda. Better seeds, better research, extension services, use of fertilizers, connect to markets. And we need to get on with it. One of the things also, which is a big issue in Africa, is that the countries themselves often have more barriers to trade with one another than they have barriers with Western countries. And I think also there, Africa can really help itself also by creating one big internal market. Yeah? India is 1.2 billion people, China 1.2 billion people. Sure, there are some barriers between states in India, I'm sure there are, but at the same time, it's one country, no? And it's managed as one country. China is the same. Let's get these trade barriers down in Africa, and let's connect the countries better with one another so that one can trade with one another and use one another's markets. Thank you. That was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Jos, and all the participants. Please take a minute and provide us with your valuable feedback. This will be very helpful in designing future webinars on important topics. Thank you again.